All right, I want to welcome everyone. We are honored tonight by the presence of an old friend of Chicago, Professor Prasenjit Duara, who has been here as a student and as a faculty member, who is now, after many peregrinations, the Oscar L. Tang Family Professor, a distinguished professor, excuse me, of East Asian Studies at Duke University. My name is Hans Saucy. I am university professor in the departments of comparative literature, East Asian languages and civilizations, and the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. This evening's program is presented by the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago, otherwise known as CEAS. It's an interdisciplinary nexus, clearinghouse, and resource for academic exploration and support related to the study of Japan, China, and Korea. For more information on CEAS and to subscribe to receive our weekly outreach emails pertaining to future events sponsored by the Center, please click on the links that will be provided in the chat box. Tonight's event is co-sponsored with the International House at the University of Chicago. Founded in 1932 by John D. Rockefeller Jr., the International House of Chicago is one of 20 members of the network of international houses worldwide. In addition to supporting students, International House also serves the greater Chicago community as a cultural and intellectual center for a wide array of programs that include music and cultural performances, outreach programs with Chicago area international organizations, collaborations with foreign consulates, language exchanges and discussions, and forums and debates led by distinguished guest speakers through the Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture series. To learn more about iHouse, click on the link provided in the chat box. Have I been muted all this time? No.
No, you're good.
Okay. Sorry, a typical Zoom moment there. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to remind everyone about tonight's Q&A session that will follow the presentation. To ask a question, simply type in your question to the Q&A box. I'll now continue my introduction of Professor Prasenjit Duara. Prasenjit Duara is the Oscar Tang Chair of East Asian Studies at Duke University. He was born and educated in India and received his PhD in Chinese history from Harvard University. He was previously professor and chair of the Department of History and chair of the Committee on Chinese Studies at the University of Chicago between 1991 and 2008. Subsequently, he became Raffles Professor of Humanities and Director, Asia Research Institute at National University of Singapore. His many books include Culture, Power, and the State, Rural North China, 1900 to 1942, published in 1988, which won the Fairbank Prize of the AHA and the Levinson Prize of the AAS. His other books include Rescuing History from the Nation of 1995, a study that I find very frequently cited in my students' work, the best indication that something is staying current. Sovereignty and Authenticity, Manchukuo and the East Asian Modern in 2003, and most recently, The Crisis of Global Modernity, Asian Traditions and a Sustainable Future from 2014. He's edited Decolonization, Now and Then in 2004, and co-edited A Companion to Global Historical Thought with Viren Murthy and Andrew Sartori in 2014. His work has been widely translated into Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and several European languages. I would like now to pass simply to introducing Professor Prasenjit Duara's talk, the title of which is The Varieties of Secularism, China, Japan, and India in the Era of Abrahamic Modernity. Over to you, dear colleague.
Thank you very much, Han, for that kind introduction. And I want to begin by thanking Connie, Mara, and you, Han, for organizing this, welcoming me back to Chicago, which I left now 12 years ago. And I also want to express my gratitude to iHouse, because My first my first 2 quarters in the US was spent in IHouse, and it was a wonderful and warm introduction to the United States and, of course, to the University of Chicago and the community that it can afford sometimes. But I do want to also express my sorrow about the passing of Professor Tetsuo Najita. Tets, as we called him, did an enormous amount for East Asian studies, Japanese studies at the University of Chicago. He also did a lot in the college, and he was chair of the history department when I was brought in, and he shepherded me through my professorship in the department. So I'm also very personally grateful to him. And we have, through the Association for Asian Studies, of which I was most recently the president, we have put up an obituary as well as memories, both from me and several of your colleagues in the Department of East Asian Studies, Susan Burns, Jim Kettler, and alumnus Alexis Dudden, which you should probably, you might be interested in taking a look at. So I'm very sorry about that. But this is a long paper, and so I should move quickly. But I should also give you full disclosure that a lot of the materials that you will hear are cobbled together from my 2014, 2015 book, The Crisis of Global Modernity. So if you want more details, you can look it up there. I'm also writing this up as an independent paper, and I'll be happy to share it if you're interested. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, and on, please. As a historian, next slide, please. I wanted to, this is going to be a bit of a PowerPoint karaoke. It's more for me than for you. Just listen to me, and so that I can remember what I'm saying. And so this is what this is for. I want to tell you the story of secularism in Asia, not from the perspective of diffusionism, of modernization, of westernization theory, but from the perspective that I have tried to develop and recently working on quite considerably, of circulatory histories. I look particularly in late imperial China in part one, but I also look at other Asian societies where historically, which have accommodated considerable religious diversity, right? Now, circulatory history is an emergent methodology that sees history not in terms of tunneled national or civilizational narratives, and nor is it historical diffusionism, but rather circulatory, by which I mean when some process or activity goes from one place, transformed and is transformative. And sometimes it becomes looped. It comes back with a different meaning to the place where it might have visited earlier, but often entails all kinds of implications and ramifications that were not necessarily there the first time. And then the method that I developed, which you can also, I have a more explicit statement of convergent comparison that I will not be talking about here, though I'll be doing that in the latest issue of the Journal of Asian Studies, which is the presidential keynote address. And that's called The Art of Convergent Comparison, and it's looking at India and China. But the point of convergent comparison, just to put it very simply, is that I look at a factor like here, the ideas of secularism and religion, that penetrate these societies in a significant way. So what is penetrating is the comparator, and how it's being reacted to is what is the basis of convergent comparison. So that's basically what it is. But before we go on to the Asian societies, I want to grasp the formation of the secular in what I have called the Abrahamic societies, right, in Europe, mostly in Europe, of course. Abrahamic societies also include a lot of the Middle East. We have Charles Taylor's very persuasive account of the history of Western secularization in A Secular Age, the book. From the perspective of circulatory history, I think of it as, to provincialize Europe, as a kind of a local history of the North Atlantic that becomes hegemonic with the rise of Western global dominance, right? I want to see how the package described by Charles Taylor impacts, transforms, and is transformed in the different parts of Asia, so that the religion-secular relationship is more complexly understood in the global context. Next, please. Okay, the Taylor narrative is quite well known, and so I will not go into it in detail. But the most important transition that he talks about happens within a Christian framework. And it's a transition from religion, from the world being a porous world where the supernatural and the earthly dimensions are interactive and have causal relationships, are seen to have causal relationships. So from this image of Catholic Europe, you begin to move to the idea of the buffered self in Christian Europe as a result of the disenchantment. So there's much more sufficiency understood within the world, and that sort of brackets the role of the supernatural. Now, various other historical factors, such as the civilizing process and the disciplining process of early modern Europe, also condition the idea of the individual to the ideas of a sufficient self. But this gradually, what happens, as he shows, is that this limitation of the role of God in particular in the Western tradition proceeds to the degree that the buffered self loses the need for God himself, well known as himself. I call this the transcendence of transcendence, right? So Taylor's concept of religion is more or less equated with the idea of faith and belief at its core. But I think that this definition is an Abrahamic or perhaps even a Protestant one that, of course, people like Talal Asad and so on have discussed for a long time. But I try to show how it cannot be sustained for many other parts of the world. In many other religions, ritual, cultivation practices, reciprocities, vows, divination, sacrifice, and a whole host of other modes of human, superhuman intercourse play an equally important role, if not more important. While, of course, a measure of belief is necessary, belief can be fickle, and it doesn't necessarily trump all else. Though I must say Trump tried to trump all else. But the cultivation of moral behavior or duty may play a very supreme role. I remember being struck by this about a long time ago, long before the time I first went to Singapore, let's not count the years, where we visited the various Indian and Chinese temples, and you found students from both communities and all communities visiting all these temples and praying there to make sure that they could get through the exams. You don't want to keep any base uncovered. So you can see here that this is not quite the centrality of faith and belief. It has a very different kind of sense and meaning. Now, Taylor also identified different periods in which religious belief comes to be tied to various forms of modernity, such as of modern identity, such as nationalism or ethnicity, and providential political missions, and so on. But in the contemporary world, and that this is his conclusion of what happens to, I'm trying to get to see some of the audience, side-by-side gallery. Okay, yeah. He finds faith and belief in the West to have become a kind of a voluntary phenomenon, right? Unmoored from its institutional underpinnings, a trend that we can say begins with laicization. And so today I can believe in whatever, Mayan religion, and tomorrow I can be Falun Gong, and so on. So I mean, I'm obviously simplifying and being simplistic, and religion is much more serious, but you do have that voluntarist choice. Next, please. What for Taylor is a phase in secularization in the whole process of 300 years, 400 years that he talks about, is what I deem to be crucial to it. That is what I call the confessionalization of religion, which takes place in the 16th, 17th centuries, wars of religion in Europe. What happens here is that the identity of a chosen people, and this is very much a chosen word, because it fits very well, I think, with the national model. The identity of a chosen people or a community is integrated with state power and serves as a kind of proto-nationalism. We all know that the end of the wars of religion was proclaimed with the doctrine of quis regio, ius religio. Horn's Latin is probably much better than these 4 letters that I can pronounce. But effectively, who rules, it's his religion. So in other words, religion becomes equated with the rule of a ruler. Now, the Western nation states fostered some form of national religion all the way through the 20th century. And in some ways, you still have it, although hopefully it is not as significant as it was during difficult times. Even revolutionary France established secularism as a distinct principle of governance only around 1907. So what we have is that we're reminded that the secularism is also framed in these Christian terms as well. Now, so what is the specificity of what I call confessionalization of religion, which I then say becomes transformed into a confessional nationalism, right? The specificity of religious community forms is that of what I mentioned, the chosen people, the state-church integration, the idea of the chosen being saved versus the damned, which is very much the self-other relationship. And here, what is very important, I think, sociologically, is the social organization of religion is a very important area. And I don't have time to go into it very much, but especially when compared with the non-Abrahamic world, especially the close church-state relations. I think it's a little different with the ulama, but certainly in the European Christian traditions, that church-state relationship and the notion of belief is very important in the way that nationalism also emerges. Circulation, that is the movement of these ideas of what is the nation and what is the place of secularism and religion in the nation, as they circulate beyond Europe with European dominance, of course, takes place within the asymmetries of power and with temporalities in a global history. One of the concepts that I developed here, actually just in the last 2 days, is the notion of a telescoping that takes place in the process of asymmetrical absorption of religio-imperial power. What happens is that just as the verb, I looked up the verb telescoping, except I can't find it now, and in the dictionary, and the verb is really says to force or slide one thing into another, or one view into another, right? And so what I'm saying happens is that secularist ideas come to the non-West, come to Asia, simultaneously with religious communalism or a kind of confessional nationalism. Now, in the Taylor view, this is of course, he emphasizes this in his history, but I was looking for it, and you see that there are different phases, and we can see these phases. So first there's a kind of a proto-nationalism or confessionalization, confessional nationalism, and then various reasons having to do with global political economy and other matters. What you begin to get is that there is the structure of secularism is created within safe havens, within a certain state structure, right? And so these are kind of drawn out, but I'll try to show that this is not a permanent change. You can always go back, right? So, but in Asia, these two processes are maybe slightly contradictory, but they're simultaneous or telescopes, right? You get that telescoping vision because of imperialist penetration, missionizing, and lack of cultural recognition of Asia in a Hegelian sense. Okay, so Asian nationalists seek to imitate, of course, by the 19th century, as we know, strong nation really has come about through confessionalization. Can we have the next slide, please? So now let me turn to China before I go back to some of these questions. To look at the relationship of religiosities and state power in China. In order to understand secularism in Asian societies, we need to inquire what came to be called religion in these societies and in China in particular. And this is, of course, something that has been on the table since at least Tala-Lasa, perhaps earlier. And we have this wonderful quotation that comes from Casey Chang's Shamanism in Politics from the 4th century BCE, a minister explaining the cosmology to the king of Chu, right? Anciently, he says, men and spirits did not mingle. There were specialized men and women called Shi and Wu, who supervised the position of the spirits at the ceremony, sacrificed to them, and otherwise handled religious matters. But later, men and spirits became intermingled, with each household indiscriminately performing for itself the religious observances which had hitherto been conducted by the shamans. As a consequence, men lost their reverence for the spirits. The spirits violated the rules of men, and natural calamities arose. Hence, the successors of Shaohao, to handle the affairs of the earth in order to determine the proper places of men, the successors of Shaohao, to handle the affairs of the earth in order to determine the proper places of men, established these. And such is what is meant by cutting the communication between heaven and earth, right? So you cannot, so it has to be a centralized communication. The monopoly of communication with the supernatural, with heaven in this case in particular, is with one political center, with one religio-political center. Casey Chang notes that this myth is the most important reference to shamanism and its central role in ancient Chinese politics. He argues that the king himself was the most important shaman, and he and his priests sought to monopolize access to the sacred authority of heaven. In other words, the emperor, aided by his ritual specialists, not only claimed monopoly of communication power with regard to other clergy or church, but also with regard to the people. And this is the most important thing that I will talk about as this vertical division in Chinese society. This modality of historical authority was very different from other so-called axial age civilizations. I have a little picture here of Tiantan, which many of you know about, I'm sure. I'll tell you a little story about it later too, about how it was moved into an enclosed space from being an open air worship to heaven and to the natural deities who are, of course, worshipped in there. Now, to go a little bit, I don't want to spend too much time on this axial age theory, but I think it is important to understand in this context. Axial age theories of Karl Jaspers in the 30s, and then, and our own Benjamin Schwartz and Shmuel Eisenstadt and people talked about axial age as the 6th century BCE, when across the Eurasian world, you got certain civilizations in the Bronze Age. Once you had cities and empires and so on. You had the idea of a transcendent authority as opposed to what should we call a transactional authority, somebody who gives you returns from the supernatural. But this is a much more sort of claiming of moral authority that an individual subject in this earth can derive from the cultivation of the transcendent power. And this, for 19th and 20th century sociologists, this was a very important, historical sociologists, very important idea behind civilizational concepts. And Max Weber saw in China, of course, much more immanence than transcendence, right? So the divine was in the world. And so an individual did not have quite the moral power to be able to challenge the institutions of this world from a superior accepted power beyond the world. But, the version is Thomas Metzger's old book on elusive immanence, which I've just recently returned to. I think it's an interesting idea. Eisenstadt adapts it to an idea of this worldly transcendence. So yes, heaven is transcendent, but its effects are mostly this worldly. So there's some confusion on that. My take on all this is that, like other imperial societies, China combines transcendent and immanent dimensions in unique historical configurations and directions, right? Heaven was a source of transhuman moral and cosmic power, which could be tapped through moral and supraordinary cultivation practices. Taoism and Buddhism were other very important traditions which provided sources of transcendence in the society. We know the Tao of which we can speak is not the Tao. You have Dharma and Fa, truth and duty in Chinese Buddhism. So by the late imperial period, you do have composite notions of transcendence, which are widely available in Chinese society, despite the effort of the imperial state to control and monopolize transcendent power. And of course, think of it this way. I've always thought of transcendent power has a propulsive function, right? So it's messiahs, those who are out of power, those who feel that this, transcendent power is always being monopolized and grabbed by political authorities, and that often comes to an end. And so, like the classic Protestant revolution, you need another transcendent movement to renew this society. And you've had this all along in Asian societies, right? So this propulsive function. But the imperial state sought very, very hard to prevent this propulsive function of people seeking moral authority outside of the imperial channel by banning worship of heaven and directly controlling and licensing Buddhism and Taoism, the state religions. Can we move to the next, please? Here's another picture. I think you went to the one before. You have to go to the one after, Connie. Connie, are you there? Okay, next, please. Yeah, I just put up those pictures. No, that next, please. Can I control this? Something's, yeah, that's the one. This is, as you can imagine, a very contemporary painting. I don't know of any pre-modern Chinese, and Han, correct me if I'm wrong, representations of heaven. It's only when humans can believe that they can represent heaven that, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't going to say anything except I
Okay,
think you're right. Yeah.
yeah,
You know,
okay.
what
We'll come back
representation
to it.
should there be? It would be very schematic. So the pictures are utterly modern. Yeah.
Yeah, utterly modern and utterly human.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next, please. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about, the vertical division of Chinese religiosity. So although only the emperor could worship ancestors who could be worshipped by the rest of the population to satisfy their desires for human flourishing, right? But you could not sort of appeal to heaven, because then you would be usurping the power of the emperor, first in theory and then perhaps in practice. So the vertical division is a result of the power of the emperor versus clerishes. Yes, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, but it is a long history of the victory of the imperial state. I think Peter Bowl and people talk about how the Confucians kept trying to hold on to their superior moral authority, but by Kangxi, certainly Huang Jixing argues that was the end. And whether it had to do with the Siku, Chuanshu, or whatever. Anyway, we know that Confucian Mencius sought to locate heaven beyond the exclusive access of the ruler and to create this ideal of the Junzi, of the moral ideal. And then we have in the late imperial period, people like Wang Yangming and the Taizhou school, who probably concurrently with the Protestant Reformation, with a lot of bhakti movements in South Asia and so on, are also talking about autonomous senses of transcendent authority. But I'm more interested in what happens to this kind of transcendent authority in the groups that I have studied for a long time now, or I had studied for a long time, the Sanjiao Heyi societies, the 3-in-1 religious societies that combine Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and which I have called redemptive societies, because they do want to save the world and save the self and all of these kinds of things. And then we see how, and I'll come to that in a bit, but let's move on to the next section, which I don't want to spend too much time on as it's a long paper, but I think most people know how the Qing Imperial Orthodoxy, all its different institutions and its ideologies, lineage ideologies, state cult, a state-oriented literati, do try to co-opt, do try to establish an orthodoxy that seeks to prevent popular notions of religiosity and transcendence and so on from acquiring the kind of moral authority that the imperial state sought to control. Can we move on to the next? Okay, here is a kind of a state ceremonialism, which I think we see back again in China, in most of East Asia, that sort of reflects the modernization of the ritual, of state rituals in the imperial period, and that the Meiji state, of course, in Japan picks up and develops in important ways. Next, please. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So vertical integration versus vertical mediation. We've talked about vertical division, right? So back, please. Oh, was that the? Where are we? I'm not clear myself. Which is it? No. Okay. No. Yeah. Vertical integration versus vertical mediation. In Europe, I've already talked about how you begin to get this confessional nationalism, but it's interesting to see how that happens. It is, of course, also tied. It's tied centrally to the formation of competitive states, European states, which is characterized centrally by the absence of sovereignty in any particular area, because, you know, the Holy Roman Empire has sovereignty only in name. And many historians have talked about it. One of the most compelling I've found is fiscal militarism, also developed by a Chicago colleague of mine, a senior colleague, Bill McNeil. Fiscal militarism, which is the motor of competition fueled by state debt and reliance on inter-European credit markets. And this is how they argue the political economy of nationalism and colonial conquest and so on emerges of nation states. But I want to add to that that community formation also takes a new direction with the decline of the Holy Roman Empire, as the identity of believer, qua believer, became constitutive of the community. And you see this in the vernacular Bibles and so on, particularly in England, but in all kinds of other parts as well that developed. And so they create confessional communities where faith-based religions become the basis of state power. So in contrast to the Chinese situation, what we see here is a vertical integration, right? Where state, clergy, and believer are one under God in confessional communities. So these are proto-national competitive communities. And here, of course, the Weberian arguments about the Protestant disciplining and so on are also very important, because they tie capitalism very much to national character, to national religion, well, especially in Holland, but later on in England and so on. Over the next several centuries, these become competitive nation states, and their secularization, as I've said, is mostly achieved by the 20th century. This is, of course, the same period when the rest of the world is trying to actually produce a confessional nationalism as an instrument for competition. For instance, you have state Shinto, you have, in India, you have Hindutva. In China, you have a sudden move in that direction as well. If you look at the Taipings, they were very nationalistic, but religion was sort of more. They were more confessional than confessional nationalists. But there a transition in that period. The Boxers was a kind of a homemade confessional nationalism in some ways. But by and large, in China, did not see the creation of this, and it did not see these confessional nationalisms largely, or at least through the religious mode. You can see it through communist modes, but largely because the historical inheritance was one of vertical division, with imperial orthodoxy versus popular religion. But this division was also mediated at a point where orthodoxy met popular culture. Next slide, please. So religion in popular culture. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I want to just say here, I'm going to go through quickly, that popular religion was a vibrant communication. I have discussed this in several works, and many people in Chinese studies have shown it is a field of communication, negotiating between different levels of society, of accommodation and adaptation, camouflage and resistance, bringing state, local elites, and popular society in overlapping cultural nexus. But what I argue in my last book is that the cultural nexus is also what we can see as a translucent canopy, so that you have a lot of activities that are going on that look pretty orthodox, or that don't look like they are violative of the state ritual mode and the imperial ideology. And you have others that adapt, like the Mulian or the Miaoshan idea and so on. But then you can only see it translucently, right? What's going on underneath, and because the elites also participate in both levels, right? So you only see it that way and you don't. So sectarian, redemptive societies flourish in this hothouse, and their followers are in, by the 20th century, their followers are in the tens of millions, if not more. They become, the only remnant we have of it right now is the Falun Gong, right, which emerged anew in the 1990s. They become especially important in the 20th century as they expand not only as 3-in-1, but 5-in-1, including Islam and Christianity and others, and adapt to modern circumstances with even a stronger redemptive call. And this is also where, in fact, the Japanese people who were studying this said that the biggest competition to this was actually Christianity in the 20th century. Christianity was making similar inroads with its calls. But these redemptive societies are important because they had connections to composite traditions of transcendence. But on the other hand, they were also committed to popular practices concerned with human flourishing, especially through spirit mediumship, which even the most sophisticated of these people didn't give up. Like Kang Yu Wei was the head of Tao De Yuan, Tao De Hui. Yeah. So, and it's also interesting to see that the process of expansion is not by converting, but by absorbing, right? This is very interesting. And Tim Brooke once wrote about them that they're not syncretic so much, but they really are a condominium of religions. And that's what they are. They're sort of absorbing. They absorb a lot. But they do have, when pushed to shove, they will challenge the power that represses them. So it's not entirely absent. Can we move to the next, please? Okay, just some contemporary Red Swastika society somewhere in Southeast Asia. Okay, next, please. And here again, you have the Tridharma in Indonesia, which is wonderful. And this is quite recent, not that recent, but 60s, 70s. Yeah. Next, please. So state and redemptive religions. So despite the elite and even orthodox connections, redemptive as well as secular societies, sectarian societies, were attacked by both the KMT and the CCP, especially the messianic ones, right? The ones that really took their transcendent call seriously. Seek empowerment, personal empowerment through transcendent authority. But that empowerment is not by that reason political. By banning religious groups, the state actually extends the logic that politicizes them. And we see cases from Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. They clarify that when the state does not deny the religions their right to express their urge to transcendence, they tend to be happily non-political, especially in Taiwan after 1987. Now, we don't have time to go into the CCP, but I think that that whole confessionalization mode was, of course, undertaken very seriously by the Communist Party. And I think that there is no better book than the Apter Sage book on Yan'an, I think what's called Mao's Republic or something like that, where they talk about ritual bonding through small group function campaigns that build up the basis of this kind of identification of culture, of communism and Mao cult and nationalism all into one. Next, please. So in and other faith-based communities becoming vertically more integrated. Secularism brought religions under the enlarged state order, both to protect from the others and ultimately from the state itself, but also for state building purposes. Because once you can regulate these organizations within a secular framework, you can actually control them much better and get them to do your biddings, your social welfare and things. The Japanese particularly did it very well. Now, this was a model that was picked up by the non-West. Despite the absence of a historical legacy of faith-based communities, the Chinese state quickly adopted the Western concept of secularism. It realized that the modern state could secure the advantages of the secular system only by mobilizing religious entities and resources for social welfare, education, etc., within the proactive framework of state regulation. The modern state actually had to create a foster church-like organization, calling into existence national level Buddhist and Taoist organizations. But these were very weakly implanted in society, as they continue to be. So it just does not follow the Western model of secularism, what it does. Meanwhile, the vertical division becomes even more important, and all popular religions are now regarded as not religious, they are superstitious, right? And the redemptive societies as well, and they were attacked for that. Okay, so let's move on. Next slide, please. Japan. Now, Robert Bellah talked about Japan as non-transcendent. And he knew with Japanese history. One of the things he said is they know all about transcendence. They knew it from Buddhism, they knew it from the Chinese case, but they used the axial to overcome the axial through the doctrine of the divine emperorship. Of course, in practice, Buddhism and syncretic forms of transcendence did exist through Japanese history, but they were probably more controlled than in most other Asian societies by national status kinds of ideas. The Meiji state did something very interesting, and we come to the telescoping business here now. The Meiji state adapted the Chinese cult system to synchronize state ritual under the enhanced ideal of the divine emperor, right? So they bring back the divine emperor to a central position, to a central ritual position in a way, or maybe not so ritual. And then they claim, because they have to be modern, they claim secularism. But the way they telescope the secularism and confessionalism is an interesting way, which I think we also see in India, which is by declaring something called state Shinto, which they call a state ceremony, versus shrine Shinto, which is religion, right? So this is how you get the telescoping of secularism and confessionalization. So shrine Shinto continues to develop the religious sentiments, and certainly it is catalyzed in the Meiji period, but it is declared to be secular as well, because Shinto, after all, is a state ceremonial, just like you have your unknown soldiers and so on. And at the same time, the Japanese Meiji state also attacks the alternative universalism's transcendence of the redemptive religions. Of their identity, whether it's Tenrikyo, Omotokyo, Hitonomichi, Reiyukai, and others, which constitute 15 to 20% of the population. These are silenced by state Shinto, as similarly in China, as being superstitious and not religious, right? So you get this telescoping moment that is a little different from the Chinese case. Okay, next, please. Okay, just a picture. Next, please. So what are the historical lessons? The deconstruction of the European narrative from a worldview shows not only circular modification, but also a traffic between ideas, practices, and institutions traveling within a society's religious and secular forms. So we can see this notion of traffic, for instance, in Weber's Protestant ethic, where religious values penetrate into capitalist economic principles and so on. And also, this circulation can loop back to the West, where there may be reconfessionalization after secularism. You know, if you look at Carl Schmitt, the philosopher who was considered the most important Nazi philosopher, some might doubt that, but he says that, you know, the most important concepts for the modern nation are old theological concepts: the God as the exception, and the friend enemy as the friend enemy of the confessional religion, right? The saved and the damned. So you get this actually active transformation going on from confessionalism to confessional nationalism. And Shinto, Hindutva, Nazis, etc. are all involved in this. I'll skip what I've already said about China. So let's move on to the last case I have of India. In India, of course, is historically very pluralist, with varieties of transcendent authorities that mix with forms of development of devotional and contractual religion. The impact of confessional secular telescoping can be witnessed in 4 important responses. The first is a secular nationalism committed to freedom of religion. This is the Constitution of India, Nehru, Gandhi, and so on. Then there is reform Hindu spirituality, where religion sort of keeps or privatizes the transcendent question. This is the case with people like Vivekananda, Gandhi, Agnivesh. And then you have the confessionalization of Hinduism, where with the BJP, now BJP successor to Hindu Mahasabha, an attempted confessional nationalization of Hinduism and Islam. And all of this then becomes, of course, catalyzed by the politics of identitarian representation by religion and class for electoral mobilization. Next slide, please. And then we'll come to the last. So generally, the Indian Constitution has limited or differentiated transcendent power, from capturing political power, right? Gandhi's truth is now contained in the truth of, which actually sought to transcend historical truth, is contained in the Constitution, and the Constitution just ignores Gandhi's truth. Most religious activists learn to reconcile truth with modern notions of linear time and political citizenship and so on. At the same time, many practices and ideas of religious life are being confessionalized, as I've said, like Shinto and the telescoping process. Now, the telescoping process in the Hindu India case is also very interesting. It's very similar to the Shinto case. Hindutva claims to be secular. What the BJP calls Hindutva, which is different from Hinduism, and in fact, it claims it's the most secular. It doesn't privilege any religion. It's just a way of life. It's a moral way of life, not a religion. So by doing this, it telescopes the moral dimension of secular doctrine to dominate by cultural majoritarianism, right? So unlike East Asia, where a state-led national confessionalization suppresses popular religiosities and national enemies, in India, it becomes more of a majoritarian domination of minorities. So my final conclusion is, I've done this at record speed. Can you move to the last slide, please? Secularism is difficult to keep from being captured by this whole telescoping process, right? It does not automatically permit religious plurality. It is captured either by confessionalization nationalism mode, by the majority, as in India, or manipulated by the state, and most dangerously by conjoined action of both. But if constitutionalism by itself cannot secure a sufficient moral foundation, constitution will necessarily have to secure a secular pluralism where the rights against religious discrimination are as foundational as the right to religious freedom. Okay, that's it. Have I left enough time?
Yes, indeed. I was groping around for the mute button, and I want to applaud your speech. Thank you very much. Hold on, let me push a button here. Just a couple of reflections on this absorbing and extremely complex and rich talk. I think you exemplified what you were talking about, a spiraling, spirally looped circulatory history. Not only were you talking about such histories, but you were exemplifying them in the way that you were setting up this problem and following it through its different contexts and dimensions. I'm just going to claim the unequal privilege of the introducer to ask the first question.
Yeah,
which is really more of a reflection than a question. But as I was listening, particularly to the last half of the talk, I was thinking about what we sometimes call the civic religion of two countries that have had the most split religious pluralism in their legal documents. I'm talking about France and the United States. And of course, you know, in France, they have something called the Pantheon, where the national heroes are enshrined, and periodically there are controversies about who's in it and who's out of it. It's the fact that there are controversies reveals that it's still an important symbolic space, even for people who might think of themselves as non-believers in the French civic religion. There's still a stake there. And in the US too, you know, ever since Tocqueville, people have talked about the civic religion of things like the rule of law and the ceremonies of voting and so on. And it seems that part of the function of such a civic religion is to try to provide space for the accommodation of religious minorities. And when the civic religion is under menace of being monopolized or appropriated by any one group, things get bad for religious minorities. I, this is one of the reflections. The various attempts to reinstate imperial ceremony in China too have differing kinds of valences. Yuan Shikai had a doomed attempt to walk up to the altar and address Tian as the emperor, and there were many reasons for his downfall, but probably one of them at least was that he couldn't convince anyone. So what about the space for civic religion in general? Can you say anything about how much doctrine and substance such a civic religion may have, or how much it should avoid having concrete doctrine and ceremonial and substance? Is there a kind of a general issue that we could talk about here?
Well, that is, of course, an increasingly important question, right? And your former colleague, Phil Gorski, has written a whole little book about this as a student of Bella, who first introduced the idea of civic religion. Of course, civic religion was, as you say, France. It was Rousseau who felt that, that was necessary. And probably Durkheim probably had some sense of that, right? When writing. So it is a French tradition, very much so. And the Chinese, of course, I haven't thought about it in the Chinese context, but I think that the history of civic religion in the US is instructive. And following from what Phil Gorski has written, he says they've always been, he's arguing for the revival of sort of in post-secularism as a kind of a civic religion that makes explicit what basic beliefs and so on, and then protects, right, those who don't believe. But he says there have always been two versions. One is, and he traces it to the Puritans. One is a much more inclusive, but the other is what we're seeing now, right? Even right from the time of Cotton Mather and so on, they always thought that the religion that the state should impose the biggest enemies were first the American Indians and then everybody else, right, who are not themselves. So civic, it depends on how you frame it, I think. And the Chinese have, so I mean, it's another topic that could probably be well worth investigating in East Asian and other contexts.
Yeah. I personally wouldn't complain if children were made to learn the Gettysburg Address again. It wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea for remembering what it's all about.
Yeah.
I prefer that to the Pledge of Allegiance anyway, which has always seemed to me to have a kind of a spooky feature.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, I think you're right about what level of specificity and doctrine should it contain. I think that's something that should be discussed very much. Yeah.
All right, and we're beginning to get some questions piling in here. All right, here's one question that I think you already adumbrated, so the request is really for more clarifications and examples. Would Kang Youwei's effort to create a Confucius church be seen as a direct answer to European national churches, and would it also constitute an effort toward confessional nationalism?
Yes, I have paid some attention to this question, and it's very interesting. I mean, it fits in a way. Kang Youwei is to apparently send spies to church sermons and so on to find out what they did on Sundays and what is it that they did. So I mean, his effort was very much. He saw very much this Protestantism as strengthening the nation by mobilizing belief and faith. And he thought that there was a way to do that with Confucianism. I don't think it worked at all in China, where I have an essay also in that same book and some other book, where I talk about the different faiths of Confucianism within China and in Southeast Asia, right? And I argue that sort of being tied to the colonial context made a difference to why Confucianism survived there much better, and in Hong Kong as well. But in China, it had become so connected to the imperial system, whether through the examination and so on, that it just didn't, the role it had was an ethical role, right?
Mm.
And it wasn't one of faith and belief. And ultimately, Kang Youwei had to give it up. He was much more celebrated abroad than in China. And, he basically slipped into the redemptive society. The Dao Dao Hui was Confucianism in a redemptive society with Buddhism and everything else. And so I do think he tried to create a confessional nation, but for various historical reasons, both immediate and long term, it didn't take. It was like the Chinese state trying to call up religions to serve as religions of faith and mobilize their what do you call them? Their sheep or whatever, their flocks, not their sheep.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Eisenhower used to say, "We must have religion,"
There you go.
and left it at that. It's interesting that state Confucianism has failed to flourish everywhere except in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very curious. I think we need an ethnographic study of this. So another question coming in looks at the same material, but from a different angle, asking about the shifting role of Confucianism in orthodoxies sponsored by the state before the Republic, which seems to find a parallel in redemptive societies historically and popular Confucianism. In your analysis, as our audience member, how would you map your telescoping model on the transformation in Confucianism in China over the course of Chinese history?
Well, I'm not sure that, this is what I just said in a way, that there was an effort to telescope it with Kang Youwei, thinking of it both as a universal sort of ethical religion or ethical cosmology, and trying to make it a national movement. And I think it did not work. Right. And I think that today too, I'm not paying that much attention to what is happening to Confucianism today. We have a new colleague, Anna Sun, who is doing a lot of that. But I don't think that it can, I don't think it can work as a confessional national form. That's what I would say. I think philosophically it can operate as a cosmopolitan doctrine. But sociologically, it's very hard for it because it doesn't have the link to, I began by saying that you don't necessarily need belief, but there is a salvational element that is important in religion, right? And it doesn't quite have that in immediate personal terms.
Yeah, for me, one of the great lost opportunities of Chinese civilization, and which still makes my heart beat a little faster, is the so-called left-wing disciples of Wang Yangming, people like Wang Gun, who proclaimed that the streets were full of sages, right? And who were going around trying to convert people to his version of a very personal relationship with the Tao, but he was rubbed out by the people who were the holders of contemporary offices and orthodoxies. And really the whole movement sort of, fizzled away, and only a few sparks remained here and there.
Well, it went on to become confessional nationalism in Japan.
Yeah. Well, there's another opportunity to tip our hats in the direction of Tet Snajita, who
there you go.
Such beautiful books on on the merchant Confucianism, and this again secular but very pragmatic take on the classics. All right, another question from Ted Fishman says, "What a great talk. Thank you. I wonder if you have any thoughts on long, that is centuries-long colonial rule in which a colonial power of one religion leveraged the spiritual or religious authority of local rulers of other religions. I am, of course, thinking of the Dutch in Indonesia."
Can we ask him to say a little bit more about what does he mean by leverage?
Well,
Can he ask?
Ed, if you're out there, can you type a little bit more perhaps on the,
Or get him to speak?
or speak? Yeah, I don't know how we would unmute you. Hello, Ted.
He can mute
Well,
himself.
hello.
Hi, Ted.
Hi, so nice to see you. So nice to see you. How wonderful. Well, I mean that the Dutch, they came into a very strongly Muslim country.
Yeah.
And they really made almost no effort towards conversion or to assert religious authority. But they really made strong relationships with local sultans who did have strong spiritual and religious authority over their people.
Yeah.
And, in a way, they kind of both atomized religion, but also used the universality of Islam in Indonesia to their advantage.
No, I think that's a very interesting case. And I can't think of any other colonial power that was actually able to do that. Certainly the British in South Asia tried to stay away from religious things. They didn't even patronize the Christian missionaries because they were so nervous about getting into religious trouble. I think that, yeah, that is an interesting. There is, of course, there's this, what's his name? Strathern, Alan Strathern has written a kind of a book on religious, he had done a lot of work on these transcendent religions and colonialism. And what he tries to show, I think, is that wherever there were societies where there were transcendent religions earlier, colonialism couldn't really convert there easily, or they did not make inroads. So transcendence has this other political dimension, right? And so, but in most cases, they also stayed away from it. But the Dutch Indonesian case, or in Dutch Indies case, is very interesting. And I wonder if it had also to do with divide and rule, not so much with the Hindu Buddhists, but with the Chinese, perhaps. But how it was able to mobilize, I don't know the details of it, but it sounds more like an exception. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. All right. Very good to think with, though, these examples. All right. Another audience member asks if you would please talk about the role of temples and family shrines in popular religion. I'm wondering what forms popular religions take. For example, when the state dismisses local cults as excessive sacrifice, or yinsi, what precisely does the state refer to?
Yeah. I am not sure that I have an answer to this question. What I do know is that by and large, I mean, it's not just state, I don't know why they would, excessive sacrifice would be condemned, but there is a kind of disciplinary restraint to local festivities, so that they would often be disrupted because men and women were mixing, right? And engaging in all kinds of licentious activity. And so the state cult did encourage a kind of disciplining of pleasures and leisures, and pleasures, not leisure. And I think the lineage ideology might have also played a role in that, because after all, at the local level, it was a competitor to many of these in different places at different times and so on. So I don't have a good answer, but I think it's an interesting issue to explore.
Yeah, maybe the passage in the Analects where it says that you're not supposed to sacrifice to someone who is not in your lineage could have been used as a kind of a break on such customs.
That's right, and you could be sacrificing to heaven.
Well, Bugandang. We have a question from Viren Murthy, just a little bit north of us. Hello, Viren. He thanks you for your wonderful talk. I second that motion. I want to briefly return to your discussion of confessionalization in your three cases. You mentioned in passing that the Mao period might evidence confessionalization, and this brings up the issue of the confession and revolution. It would appear that Japanese and Chinese modes of confession are different with respect to revolution, and this might be related to the role of the emperor in Japan.
Yeah,
I'm thinking of how Japanese were selective in interpreting Confucianism.
yeah.
The Indian case might be different, but perhaps you could discuss a bit more how Reform Hinduism might link to revolutionary confessionalization.
Well, there's so many questions there, but I'll go to the Indian case because I didn't get a chance to develop it. Thank you, Viren, for those questions. Um, the Indian case, I think clearly it is Reform Hinduism creates the basis for it's very interesting and complex, the basis of confessionalization, right? If you look at Dayanand Saraswati of the Arya Samaj, I mean, what was he doing? He was basically fighting against missionaries in the local bazaars. That's what he was doing. He was saying, we have all the things that you have. He was kind of a Kanye Way of India, and he wanted to create that kind of thing. Now, sometimes he's put up as a reformer, and I myself am ambivalent. I think he was a reformer, but he was also, I think, very much the basis of this confessionalized national model. The only difference between Kang Yue and him was that he was much more successful than Kang Yue. So that's what I would say. And we have to explore the conditions under which he becomes more successful than Kang Yue.
All right. Another question has to do with Guo Wengui, whose videos often feature Buddhist ideas and clothing or symbols, and whose followers are often quite similar in actions and behaviors and attitudes to followers of religious movements such as Falun Dafa or Bob Fu's Christianity. So there's a concrete case. I don't know if you're familiar with Guo Wengui.
No, but he's a contemporary guy.
I'm just guessing from the question. It looks like it.
Yeah. I don't know what to answer since I don't know that very well, but I do have read a book that deals with some of these guys. And I think one of the most interesting things in these contemporary religious movements in China is how much they are, how much autonomy they have in these practices and what are the ways in which they get linked back into the state models of an acceptable religion. And that, it seems to me, would be a very important constraining factor in understanding how and what they can do. But there is an interesting book, I forget who it's by, but looking at different Buddhist movements in China today. But a lot of it is also tied up with capitalism and getting ahead or securing, securing your life, right? Which is what all religions do. But within this book also shows how at different stages, as these religious leaders become more and more important, their lifestyles also change and their messages also change.
A little bit like the prosperity gospel over here.
Oh, absolutely.
Another questioner would like to hear you elaborate on the saved versus damned distinction and the friend versus enemy distinction, as in Schmidt. If they belong to the same genealogical trajectory, then what has changed and what still stays the same from this conversion of terms? What do you think about that?
That's interesting. What is same and what has changed? That's a very good question. Schmidt would think that, there is, of course, the state is much more central, right? God has been replaced by the state, right? And the state as an abstract power, right? So that's one thing. But he says all principles of modern political philosophy are essentially conversion of theological principles. So, and he says very clearly, friend and enemy is something that we have learned, obviously not in classical Christianity or pre-confessional Christianity, but he's referring to his religion as confessional Christianity, right? So I don't know what has changed, except that, you don't, maybe you still believe, maybe some people believe they're saved because they're German or Bavarian or whatever, but that would be a big difference, the notion of salvation. And here I think Ben Anderson is very important. I do like his idea of that immortality is transferred to the nation. So I think that would be a relevant question, right? Through the unknown soldier and all that.
Yeah, yeah. You remember the belt buckles of the German army in the First World War that read "Gott mit uns," God with us.
I didn't know that.
That's a dramatic piece of telescoping, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time, and we are left still hungering for more from you, Prasenjit. So thank you for
it was a lot of fun. I'm so
wide-ranging, marvelous talk.
I'm so glad we had some time for discussion. It was wonderful. I've enjoyed it very much.
Will you come back tomorrow and give another talk?
Okay, whatever. Thank you all very much, Connie, Horn, Mara, and iHouse. I don't know who to identify personally as an iHouse, but I have very warm memories. And let's remember Tetz once again at the end.
Yes, indeed. Let us do.
Okay. Bye-bye.
And we hope to see you physically in Chicago as soon as the pandemic is over.
The weather improves.
Well, things are happening on a global scale.
I remember when in CEAS, where I'm speaking now, I introduced a motion that you get less money if you invite people only in April to speak.
All right. Reward people for climbing through the snow. I have a few words for our audience. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And once again, I want to thank Professor Prasenjit Dwara, our guest speaker, for a marvelous presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed the program. As a reminder, if you are interested in learning more about the upcoming events hosted by the Center for East Asian Studies here, or our co-sponsor, the International House, please click on the links being provided again in the chat box. We would love to crowd your inbox with reminders and notices of upcoming events. We also encourage you to subscribe to the center's emails so that you can receive up-to-date information on future virtual events related to East Asia, as well as the ongoing research of students and faculty here at the University of Chicago. Thank you all for attending tonight's program, and I wish you a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.